Want to welcome you again to a video drasha. This week's Torah portion is a double portion, Chukat and Balak. And what I thought I would do this week is to just speak a little bit about both of these Torah portions. So Chukat begins with the law of the ritual of the so-called red heifer. Really, para aduma in Hebrew means a red cow. And this is called, it says, Chukat HaTorah, the law of the Torah. And this ritual of the red cow is the paradigm of what is called a chok. A chok being a mitzvah that does not have any rational explanation. This is the paradigm case. What's the background here? Well, we have to remember that in the times when the temple stood and the sacrificial system was operating, a concern with ritual purity was really very, very important, because you couldn't engage in the rituals in the temple if you were not in a state of ritual purity. Or for instance, every year on Passover, the major activity of Passover was to offer the Korban Pesach, the Passover sacrifice, and then ultimately it was the meat of that sacrifice that was eaten at the Seder. That's why we have the shank bone on the Seder plate. Well, you couldn't do that. You couldn't eat the Korban Pesach if you were not in a state of ritual purity. Now, one of the main ways in which one got into a state of ritual impurity was by coming into contact with a corpse. Meaning, if you came into physical contact, or even if you were in the same building with a corpse, you would be ritually impure. This is why to this day people who are Kohanes do not go into cemeteries, because Kohanes still preserve a kind of a remnant of this whole concern for ritual purity. Well, if one became ritually impure, then how did you become pure again? And the answer was there was this ritual of the para aduma, the red cow. And this cow that had to be totally red and would never have been worked in any way, was slaughtered, and it was burned completely up, and its ashes were then mixed with some other things and then ultimately mixed into water, and then this mixture would be sprinkled on the impure person, and that would make them, it would alleviate the impurity. So this is a ritual that, again, has no rational explanation. How do you explain that the ashes of the red cow somehow eliminate ritual impurity? It's so much so that there's actually a very interesting story in the Talmud that a Roman came to Rabbi Akiva and kind of derisively said to him, you know, you guys have a kind of a superstitious religion. After all, you've got this ritual of the red heifer. So Rabbi Akiva responds to him by basically telling him, look, you guys have some crazy rituals as well. And he mentions to him one in particular, and the Roman leaves. So you could say the answer that Rabbi Akiva gave was not to give really any explanation, but to simply say, look, okay, you think we have a crazy ritual? You guys do as well. And, that was enough for to answer this Roman. But Rabbi Akiva's students came and said, that was good enough for him. But what are you going to tell us? And Rabbi Akiva makes an astounding statement at this point. He says, the corpse neither defiles nor do the ashes of the red heifer purify. It is written in the Torah, and therefore we do it. And that really is the classic statement of a chok, that it does not have an explanation, but it's written in the Torah, and therefore we do it. And I would mention here another chok in the Torah. I discussed this a few weeks ago when we were at Parshat Kedoshim, and I made then the statement, and it's worth reiterating, I think, now in conjunction with this, which paradigmatic case of a chok. And that is, if we go back into the middle of the book of Leviticus, we have the most famous, most fundamental ethical teaching in the entire Torah, where it says, love your neighbor as yourself. And we can certainly make the case. We could write books and articles expounding on this and making the case for how this really provides the basis for our ethical system. The idea that we need to look at other people and say, that person is like me. So love your neighbor as yourself. Have the same kind of regard for other people that you have for yourself. And, I would say, coming from this verse, we have of course, there's the very famous golden rule, which we all know, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And yet we also know that there's a Jewish version of that statement, which I actually think has an advantage. The Jewish version says, what is hateful to you, do not do unto others. Because, if I say do unto others what you would have them do unto yourself, well, the fact is there may be things that I would prefer for myself. There may be things that I would like done to me, but maybe they're not universally good. I'm not sure why I should impose my desires and perhaps on someone else, and to say, so do unto others what you would have them do unto you. But if we put it in the way of course, it was Hillel who formulated the Jewish statement. Remember, that was the story of the non-Jew who came to Hillel and said, teach me the Torah while standing on one foot. And Hillel said, what is hateful to you, do not do to another. Here, I think the idea is this. And, I've often thought about this. When you hear about, people doing horrible, awful things to someone, I don't know, it could be anything from torturing someone to abusing someone to humiliating someone in a very despicable way. Or it could be even other things, insulting someone in public, for instance. And I sometimes say to myself, does that person who's doing this, do they ever think to themselves, I could be that other guy. I could be the one who's being tortured or humiliated or insulted. How can you, and I would think, I know for myself, that would put some restraint on me. Because I would picture myself. I could say, I could be in that other guy's position. And so it seems to me that rule that says, what is hateful to you, do not do unto others, which again really stems from the verse, love your neighbor as yourself, which says, look at other people and say, that person is like me. And therefore, the kind of treatment that I would not want to have done to myself, I certainly shouldn't do to others. So it's a little bit of a tangent, but the reason I mention it here today is because next to this ethical principle, which is of such fundamental importance, we have another example of a chok. That's shatnez, the law against forbidden mixtures. And you can say, why can't I wear a garment that has flax and wool in it? There's no rational explanation for that. It's another example of a chok. And the fact that I find so striking there is the juxtaposition of the two, that the greatest ethical teaching is placed right next to a chok. And I think that ultimately the purpose, the reason for these mitzvot that we can describe as chok, as mitzvot that don't lend themselves to a rational explanation, is that ultimately we do have to recognize that we can't understand everything, and some things we have to do because the Torah says to do them. And ultimately, we need to say that, when the Torah says, do not murder, do not steal, do not commit adultery, again, these are laws which we could easily explain why they exist, that you can't have a society that doesn't have those laws. But ultimately, there is a bottom line that says, we also do them because it's written in the Torah. That the source of these laws, whether they are rationally accessible to us or not, ultimately the source is the same. And there has to be an extent to which you're willing to bow to the authority of the Torah and to do it because it's written in the Torah. And I believe that these mitzvahs that are choks make that point for us. Just to speak briefly about the second portion, Balak. Balak was a king of Moab who sees the Israelites coming into Moab, of course on their way from Egypt, and he's terrified. And so he goes off to get a guy by the name of Bilam ben Beor. Bilam, or Balaam we call him in English, the son of Beor, who apparently had the ability to curse people or nations. And so Balak goes off to bring Balaam to come and curse the Jewish people. But there's an interesting fact about this, and that is in 1967 in Jordan, in a place called Deir Allah, the archaeologists discovered a structure that had some writing on a wall, and the writing there, which was in Hebrew, or there's some who think it was Aramaic. This writing tells the story of someone called Bilam ben Beor, who also was a kind of soothsayer or a seer. And so it appears that this Balaam ben Beor, who occupies 3 chapters in the book of Numbers, was a figure who was well known in that part of the world. And that inscription has been dated to around the 9th century BCE. And this is probably the most outstanding case of a biblical character that we have extra biblical, that is to say, evidence from outside of the Bible. We have extra biblical evidence that this character was known in that part of the world around that time. But of course, probably the most famous part of this story of Balaam is the talking donkey. And I have to admit, this has always been one of my favorite stories in the Torah. And Balaam is on his way to meet Balak, to curse the Jewish people, and God puts an angel in the way on the road, and the donkey, Balaam's donkey, sees the angel, but he doesn't. And so the donkey has to stop and avoid the angel, and every time he stops, Balaam hits him and strikes him and curses him, and then the next time again it happens, and 3 times the donkey is stopped on the way, and Balaam hits him, and finally the donkey turns around and says to him, "Why are you hitting me?" And then, of course, the angel finally appears so that Balaam can also see. And it is, on the one hand, an amusing story, and I think it is actually intended to be amusing. It is intended, I think one of the purposes of this narrative in this Balaam story is to humiliate Balaam, because as we've seen, he was apparently a noted character who was famous for his soothsaying, for his ability to curse. And so this story of the talking donkey is knocking him down a couple of notches. But it's also making another point, and that is God is sending a message to Balaam that says, look, you think you're going to curse the Jewish people? You can't say anything that I don't allow you to say. And just like I can put words into the mouth of this donkey, so I can put words into your mouth as well. And so what happens is Balaam goes off. Eventually, he meets Balak, and they go up on a mountain to curse the Jewish people. And instead of cursing, Balaam actually makes a series of positive statements about the Jewish people. The most famous of which is Matovu Ohalecha Yaakov Mishkanotecha Yisrael. How lovely are your tents, O Jacob, your dwelling places, O Israel. And this is interpreted to be referring to the study halls and the synagogues of the Jewish people. And for that reason, it was incorporated into the morning service. And so every morning when we come into the synagogue, really one of the first things that we say in the service are the words of Balaam. Matovu Ohalecha Yaakov, Mishkanotecha Yisrael. How lovely are your tents, O Jacob, your dwelling places, O Israel. I want to wish everyone a very good Shabbos.